Hey everyone! Today on the plastic canvas we're painting the Scoundrel from Gloomhaven by Cephalofair Games. Hey everyone, Matty from the Plastic Canvas and welcome to the second episode in this Gloomhaven series, and today we're painting the Scoundrel. But before talking about that, I just want to say another big thank you to Stella and Tarrant from Meeple University for sending me some of their Gloomhaven minis. If you haven't checked out their little corner of YouTube yet, I can definitely recommend heading over there. They do lots of awesome reviews and how to plays for Dice Tower and different things like that. I was watching them before they sent me anything, so this is an unbiased recommendation, but definitely go check out Meeple University for some awesome board game related content. So in the previous episode in this series I painted the Brute, and I always find quite a bit of a difference between painting a character like the Brute and the Scoundrel, because the Brute was only a couple of different elements. It was really his skin and then his fur and then just other things like the shield and sword and boots and things like that. There were no real small details to take care of, and so right from the start the Brute kind of, I was happy with how he was looking and everything was coming together right from the start, because everything kind of looks the way that it will at the end because there aren't those little details to take care of. When you're painting someone like the Scoundrel though, where you do have lots of those smaller details like little daggers and ninja stars and little the sheath for the swords and the straps for the different bits of armor and things like that, the end result I always find is so reliant on those little details to be painted to really kind of fill the mini out and just really kind of complete the look, because it helps to break up those larger elements that don't really have a whole lot of interest in them. Like if you look at the green areas that I've painted so far, like her sleeves and the parts of her pants that you can see that the boots aren't covering, there isn't really much detail going on there. And I mean really in her boots and the longer part of the boots there's not a lot there either. And I find that it's really those details, like I was saying before, the straps of the armor and things like that, that helps to break them up and adds so much more interest and detail and just a chance to add some kind of contrasting elements in there, like some different colors, that up until the point where you really get to painting those details, it just kind of always looks a bit boring, for lack of a better term, I suppose, because outside of that detailing, those larger sections don't have enough interest in them for the mini to sort of hold on its own. And so it really does take until you get to those smaller details that it kind of starts coming together. And that's really what I found with the Scoundrel here, was that I spent quite a bit of time not really liking how she was looking, because it always just felt like something was missing and she just looked too plain and that there wasn't a lot of life to it, I suppose. Because really, you look at the elements that really tell who she is as a character, and it is those little daggers and the ninja stars and things like that that tell you about what sort of a fighter she is, and the fact that she probably attacks from a bit of a distance and then sneaks in quickly, and you know, it really gives you a lot of information about her. Whereas without it, she's just wearing some green clothes and some boots, and that's really about it. And so knowing that right from the start, that really shaped a lot of how I painted her. So first of all, I'm not strictly sticking to the artwork. I'm going for the same kind of color palette, I guess, so that she clearly matches back to her card and her artwork. But I have veered away in a number of spots just to add some extra interest, especially outside of where the detailing will be. But then when I do get to those smaller things like the sheaths for her swords and daggers and things like that, I paint them red rather than the brown that they are in her artwork, just so that they can kind of contrast a little bit with the other parts around it and have them stand out and just kind of, just add that extra bit of interest that can break up some of those other colours. Even like the, I'm not sure, sort of the armour that she's wearing on her torso, I suppose, in the artwork it looks like it's the same colour as her sleeves and the part of her pants that kind of disappear underneath her boots, whereas I painted them in a lighter green that has quite a bit more yellow in it, just so that it kind of breaks up that darker green of the sleeves and that, just so that there is an extra visual element, I suppose, just so that it can break up some of those other colours, and so that you can kind of help discern some of the details, because when the one colour has been used a lot, it does make a mini really hard to read, because first of all, you don't have anything to settle on, you don't know where your eyes should be focusing, but also it just kind of makes everything blend in together, and it does make the mini look a lot more plain than what it actually is. So I painted the sleeves and her pants in that darker green, which kind of more matches the artwork, but then that kind of chest, torso piece, whatever it is, I then chose a different green for that, because I wanted just it to stand out a little bit more, just so that there is an extra element to add a little bit more interest. And then, as you can see here, I started to highlight the different green elements, and I'm starting that now because there are those different, there's on her right arm, there's some ninja stars, on her left arm there's the straps running around from the armor plating on her forearm. I just wanted to take care of that highlighting now, so that then when all of those little details go over the top, I don't have to try and paint the highlighting around those things. Those other parts can just get painted straight over the top of the highlights, and then I've still got those smooth highlights that run, consistently right along her arm or whichever part we're looking at. And you can see here I'm starting to mix some yellow into the green for the highlighting. I do spend a bit of time highlighting up these different green parts because, like I was saying before, this mini is so reliant on those details to really kind of flesh her out and bring her to life. Anywhere that I can add contrast is really, really important because it adds depth and helps to bring the form out. And those green parts, like I was saying, really have very little detail to them. There's no real texture or folds or anything like that. And so to add depth here, I really spent some time to gradually build up to quite a light green. So you can see initially I used, I think it was Brilliant Green, which isn't one of my darkest greens, but it's kind of on the way, but it still does have a little bit of yellow mixed into it. Then I put the green wash over the top just so that whatever detailing there was could be brought out a little bit. And then my first highlight was then with Viper Green. So normally I would base coat in a color, then put a wash, and then my first highlight would be back to the base coat, but here I jumped straight to Viper Green so that I could immediately start to add some contrast and bring those highlights out. After one or two coats of Viper Green, I then started to mix in yellow rather than moving to a lighter green because I wanted to start to, build that contrast, build the highlights up, but also because there's going to be her sword that she's holding in her right hand, I end up painting it to be like a glowing sword, which is what it's like in the artwork. So there's quite a bit of yellow goes into there. There's a bit of yellow in her chest armor piece. So adding the yellow into the highlights sort of ties those elements together. And it starts to add a lot more depth to the colours that are being used, because if you take her arm, for example, there's quite a dark green on the underside where there isn't any light hitting, but then a much, much lighter green on top. So then when I start to come to doing those smaller detailing elements, like, say, on her right arm, the straps from that armour piece on her forearm, it takes away some of the reliance on those smaller elements to really fill it out. Because now there's a much greater depth of colour, because if you look at, say, her left arm there, for example, the one that's holding up that little bag of gold, you go from that quite dark green underneath, which is in shadow, through to that much, much brighter green, which is being hit by light on top. Which just helps to bring out so much form in this sculpt, because it's not a flat image. It's not like the artwork, which is a 2D picture. This is a 3D sculpt, and, you know, the tops of her arms and shoulders and things like that are going to be getting hit by light, and so there is going to be that transition of colour. And so by going to a bit of effort with the highlighting, getting that transition, building up that contrast, it adds a lot more depth, helps to bring out the different forms. And then when I come to painting those smaller details, like I was saying, you know, the straps in the armor and the ninja stars and things like that, that reliance isn't being put on those smaller elements to be the only interesting factor and the only thing that's going to bring this character to life. By painting them over, you know, those transitional colors that shows the form, it really just helps to bring the overall mini to life and add so much more interest, because you can see that light being cast from above, and it just really does help to tie everything together. Now here you can see I'm spending quite a bit of time highlighting I don't know exactly what it's supposed to be around her waist. It's not really a skirt sort of thing, I don't know, maybe it is, but just the different brown tones that are in there, because there are a few different layers to what she's wearing there. Like, part of it kind of swishes out to the side. It's not just like one single piece of material. It's kind of either like it's been torn or layered or whatever. Anyway, so I go to a bit of time just to really build quite a bit of depth in the highlighting there. So I started with that earth brown, put the Agrax Earthshade wash over the top just to start to bring out the detailing a little bit there. And then I just went back to the earth brown for the initial highlight. And then I just started to mix in some of the leather brown for each kind of subsequent highlight after that. And as I started working closer and closer to where most of the light would be hitting, every highlight got a little bit more of the leather brown mixed in, just until it was quite a light brown. And then I was really just kind of picking out the finest edges. And that was just to build quite a bit of contrast in there and really help to bring out the form in that skirt sort of thing, because there is actually a bit of detail in there. There are, you know, some parts that flick out a little bit more than others. It's not just a flat skirt, and so I really wanted to add some depth there, kind of like what I was talking about with highlighting the green parts, in that it's not just this flat 2D part. It does have some form to it, and so I wanted to bring that out and just add further depth to the color, so it's not just a flat brown. And all of these things just add together to just bring this character to life, and again take away from the reliance on those smaller details to add the interest. And now I'm on to painting the different armor parts, and you'll see before putting any of the metallic paint down, I put down some black first, and that's so that when the metallic paint goes over the top, it really darkens it and adds a lot more depth to it, as opposed to just painting it over, say, white or the grey from the prime. And then the black wash went over the top just to knock off the shine and to really dull it down further than what it was by going over the black. And then I come back with the metallic and reapply the metallic paints just sort of sparingly on some of the edges, just to add some shine back, just to make sure that it does read as metal, but that it doesn't all have the same amount of shine, which then makes it appear as though it's been worn inconsistently. Because even though, you know, she's not like the brute getting up in the face of the enemies, through battles and just from adventuring and things like that, her metal is going to have become tarnished, it's going to have lost some of the luster, and that won't have been lost consistently. It'll have been lost in some places more than others, and so by painting over the black, first of all, it kills that real brightness that the metallic paint can have, because I didn't want it to be bright, and then the black wash over the top helps to bring out some of the detailing, but also knocks the shine off, and then coming back with the metallic again, just reapplying the shine in some spots, helps to reinforce that, first of all, it is metal, but then that it has been worn inconsistently, and all of these little things, like the highlighting on the green, the highlighting on the cloth, and the metallic being worn to different degrees, is so important for a mini like this, because if you go back to the last mini in this series, the Brute, all of these smaller details and the textures and things like that weren't as important because there weren't quite so many small details to take care of. He was basically the skin and the fur that was on his back, and then just a couple of smaller parts, but not nearly as many with the Scoundrel here. So with the Brute, I was able to just focus my time on the fur, where I worked from a really dark blue through to a very light bone color. His skin, I put some time into building up the highlights and shades, and then everything else was more or less just kind of base coated and then a wash, and then fairly minimal highlights. It wasn't as important as when you come to someone like the Scoundrel here. Whoops, lost it out of the mini holder there. But when there are so many small details that really fill it out, you then do need to focus your time on building the effects with the metal and the highlighting and those sorts of things, just to really fill the whole thing out, because you don't have one single larger element that you can focus on to act as that focal point. It's so many small things that add up together, and I guess that's really the big thing with someone like the Scoundrel here, is that there is no big key element. It's so many small things that go together to add up to the finished piece. And what that means is that every single separate little element is so important and does need the time to be spent on it to really finish it off. And so that's why in the early stages of painting the Scoundrel, when I hadn't touched too many different pieces and I hadn't spent the time to do the highlighting and that, at that point, that it really wasn't looking like much, because there wasn't enough that had been painted to really start to fill it out. But now we're really getting into lots of those smaller details, and quite a few of them have been taken care of now, and you can see there's so much more life to her, and it just really looks much more like a complete mini than what it did even just a little while ago when I was doing that highlighting on like the green parts and that. Whereas now I've painted the sheaths for the swords and the daggers, and I painted them red as opposed to brown, which is in the artwork, just so that there are a couple of little details there that stand out and break up the smaller details that are in there, because, you know, that skirt thing that she's wearing, that's already brown. If I then painted those sheaths brown, it's just another brown element right in the middle there, so I needed something to break it up. I've now painted those different armor elements that help to break the green up and add more detail into those sections. The little ninja stars that are on her arm, there's a couple of little throwing knife sort of things that she's got tied to her right forearm on the same arm as her sword there. Just going around and picking out all of these things just adds so much more interest and life to the mini, because it really starts to tell her story a lot more and just fleshes the overall thing out. And even though quite a large portion of the time that went into the Scoundrel was spent just base coating and highlighting more of the clothing, it's really just once that detailing was started, those smaller elements like the straps and the little daggers and things like that, that's when it really started to come along. And this here was about the point where, or maybe even before this, but towards this end is really when I started to like it. And up until then, even though I knew that the detailing was going to kind of take care of the issues that I was having, I still wasn't really happy with how it was looking. But at this point, yeah, really happy with how it's coming along. And now I'm just into painting the sword, and this is, I suppose, kind of the key visual element. And in the artwork, it looks like it's glowing. It's kind of got this wispiness around it. I wasn't able to do that wispiness, but I did have a go at giving it a sort of a glowy kind of look. And so what I started with was just the Viper Green as just laying down that base coat for it. And then I just mixed in a little bit of yellow, and starting at the tip, then just, put some down right on the tip, washed the bristles off, and then with the wet bristles, then just feathered it out and dragged it towards the hilt. But the more I dragged it, the less and less paint was on it, and so I just gradually transitioned back out to the green. Then I mixed in a little bit more yellow, went back to the tip, put the paint down there, feathered it towards the hilt, but feathered it less so that it started to build the opacity at the tip and less so at the hilt. Then mixed a bit more yellow in, and then just kept on repeating that over and over again until now I'm using only yellow right on the tip, just to really push the brightness out at the tip, and then it gradually then feathers out towards just that brilliant green at the hilt. And yeah, I think the effect works. And the main point of this really, though, is that is that key visual element that will draw people's attention when looking at it, and I think it serves that purpose. The other thing that I did in there was I painted her eyes, and I did them, again in the artwork, her eyes look like they're glowing yellow, and so I did that as well. And so I just laid down, again, the Brilliant or Viper Green, I can't remember which one, sorry, but just put that down first, just in the eye socket, and then just a yellow blob just sort of where her, just in the middle of it, just so that there is that little bit of a transition from green to yellow. It's very minimal, because her eyes are quite small, but it does help just to give that glowing kind of look, just to finish that off. And then I just highlighted a face around the edge of that. And now I'm just starting to get into doing the base for her, and like with the Brute, I'm just using my go-to outdoorsy basing approach, and this is so that, you know, she looks like she's standing in a similar place to where the Brute is, but I find this just to be a really good way of creating a very simple but very effective outdoor sort of base without you needing to actually physically build the environment and then paint it and all that sort of stuff. So it's just the earth brown down first, and then the sterling mud just to create a slightly elevated section where I'm not going to really place any vegetation. And then I just gave it a dry brush, and then just the wash back over the top just to dull it down a bit so it still looks like it's mud, but that the dry brush does bring out some of the detailing there. And then I just start to put down some field grass, just mainly around where the earth brown is still showing through, just so it kind of looks like there's nothing growing on that elevated section. And then I use green tea leaves as some undergrowth, and then just one or two tufts of grass just to add some extra layer to the vegetation, and just to add a little bit more interest. And then, yeah, I think it just kind of, it sells just that look that she's standing outside out in the wilderness, but very minimal effort has had to go into it. And so once the base is done there, it's just paint the edge black, and then the Scoundrel's finished. So thank you very much for spending some time watching me paint another mini. Obviously the focus there of what I was talking about was the way that a mini like this where there are so many smaller details, it really does take those smaller details to be painted for the whole mini to really kind of come together. Because outside of the details, there's not really a whole lot going on. She's basically just kind of got some very, very